made you decide to set the Cork O'Connor series in Minnesota?
I'm not native to Minnesota.
Ah, this comes out.
There we go.
Ah.
I confess.
But you wish you were.
Doesn't everybody?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
I was a gypsy kid really growing up. My family moved a great deal, so I never really had a place that I called home. About the time I turned 30, my wife and I moved to Minnesota, moved to the Twin Cities, so that she could go to the University of Minnesota Law School. I didn't have a home before that, but honestly, the minute I set foot in Minnesota, it felt to me like I'd come home. I fell in love with that place. So I always knew that whenever I finally sat down to write the book, I was promising myself wherever I was going to write, it would somehow be a homage to Minnesota. When my wife and I began vacationing in Minnesota, going up north as we call it, the first best decision we made was to vacation at a YMCA camp called Camp du Nord, which is literally across the road from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, this marvelous piece of 2 million acres of pristine water and lakes and isolated forest that straddles the border between Canada and Minnesota. And when I saw this place, I was absolutely certain people should be writing stories about it. When you're a writer of fiction, one of the things that you're always looking for is conflict, because it's conflict that drives great stories. And when I looked up in northern Minnesota, all I saw was conflict. The whites and the Ojibwe populations up there at odds with each other, very often conflict. The rugged landscape itself just suggested conflict. The weather up there, hot, humid summers, bitter, cold, raging winters, suggested conflict. And for me, it became the perfect seed, the perfect inspiration for stories of mystery and conflict. And I've been so happy that I made that decision. It's very easy for me to write about the area in which the stories are set because I love that area.
Now, is there a Minnesota culture there? Is there a culture of the people that is also enthralling you besides the landscape?
Do you know, it's such a wonderful mix of population up there. You have this is an area called the Iron Range. Back in the day, it produced the vast majority of the iron that was used for building in our country. So you have what are called the Rangers. And these are people who are very independent. Their politics are all over the place because you believe what you believe. It doesn't matter what political party is involved. You have loggers up there, people who are there because of the timber business. You have all kinds of ethnic groups up there, the Swedes and the Finns and the Irish and the Slavs and the Italians. And so all of them are putting their own ethnic spin on what happens up there. So it's just this marvelous place of great contrast and independence. And for me, it's a wealth, a never-ending wealth of character study that I could draw from up there. As a culture, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily one culture. There are many, and they're all fascinating. And in each book, I try to bring out one culture or another, focus on one culture or another, to give that great diversity to the reader.
So what were we seeing in Thunder Bay? I'll go there because I have a different reason for holding back on Heaven's Keep. And what were you seeing in Thunder Bay? What were you trying to show of Minnesota there?
Actually, in addition to just the typical setting, which would include, every reader comes to my book expects wilderness, expects the smell of pine and the feel of cold, good, clean, cold lake water, what it's like to stand outside at a sunrise and smell a campfire. Those are all kinds of elements. So they get all of that in Thunder Bay, certainly. They also get Canada in Thunder Bay because much of the backstory takes place in the very remote central wilderness of Canada back in the early 20s. So they get that as well. But what they really get in Thunder Bay is a phenomenal love story. At heart in Thunder Bay is the question, what are we willing to sacrifice in the name of love? So great mystery, great setting, and this really compelling question. So that's what I tried to deliver.
That's what I tried to deliver that one. So Heaven's Keep, we actually go to Wyoming. Now, What made you decide to go to Wyoming? It's a very different setting for you, for your fans who are used to books set in Minnesota over the Canadian border.
You know, it would seem on the face of it to be a very different setting. But when you look at the area in which much of Heaven's Keep takes place, the Wyoming setting, it's wilderness. Cork is a guy who comes out of the Minnesota wilderness. He's simply dealing with a different kind of wilderness. But it's wilderness where you have to be self-sufficient and you have to understand how to be resourceful in a setting where you don't necessarily have all of the typical things that you would fall back on in a town. So it's not so different from Minnesota in that respect. But in Minnesota, you have vast acreage of woods and lakes and all that. In the Wyoming setting where Cork finds himself, he's got that wilderness, but it's also what abuts that wilderness is very much desert or ranch land, so it's a different kind of environment there. So I was able
different kind of remote.
It's all remote. It's all isolation.
Right.
Isolation is a huge part of how I build suspense in all of my novels. So it's a different kind of remote. And it allows me then I love creating sense of place. That's really where
Place is actually a very strong character in your books, is what I'm seeing.
I think it ought to be a very strong character in any book, and it's certainly a huge element in the books that I love to read. So I wanted to give readers a different sense of Cork operating in a different environment, but again, not so far removed from what readers might expect if the whole thing had taken place in northern Minnesota.